I still have that small, filed-down piece of brass tucked away in a velvet-lined box in my top dresser drawer. Most people look at it and see junk, just a scrap of metal from a bygone era. But to me, it's the weight of 40 men's lives. It's a reminder of the day I decided that the Army's field manual was a death sentence, and that a common criminal's logic was the only thing that was going to get us across the Rhine. They called it a forbidden hack later, during the hearing, but in the mud of the Ardennes, we just called it staying alive. You see, the brass back in Washington, they loved their regulations. They loved things to be standardized, polished, and performed by the book. But the book wasn't there in the freezing rain when your M1 Garand's internal clips were freezing solid, or when the firing pins were shearing off because of the brittle cold. We were told never to tamper with our issued equipment. Destruction of government property, they warned. If you modified your weapon, you were looking at a court-martial. But when you're 19 years old and you can hear the clanking of a Panther tank's treads just over the next ridge, government property is the last thing on your mind. It started with a boy named Miller. He was a skinny kid from a watchmaker's family in Pittsburgh. He had these delicate hands that always seemed out of place wrapped around the heavy walnut stock of a rifle. We were hunkered down in a series of shallow foxholes just outside a nameless village in France, the kind of place that's just a smudge of gray stone and wet hay. The Germans had us zeroed in. Every time we tried to move, their MG-42s would start that terrifying high-speed ripping sound, like a giant tearing through a canvas sheet. We were pinned, and our mortars were useless because the firing pins were striking too soft in the dampness. We were sitting ducks, waiting for the inevitable counterattack that would wipe us out. Miller sat there in the mud, his hands shaking not from fear, but from the cold, and he pulled a small, illegal file from his kit. He looked at me and said, "Henry, the book says this pin has to be blunt, but the book isn't in this hole." He started filing. He was sharpening the firing pins of our mortar rounds, a modification that was strictly forbidden because it made the rounds hypersensitive. One slip, one drop, and the whole crew would be vaporized. It was a hack that could get you banned from the service, or worse, buried in a closed casket. But we did it anyway. I remember the smell of that morning so clearly. It wasn't just the smell of wet earth and cordite. It was the smell of old wet wool coats that never quite dried out. We lived in those coats. They were like a second skin, heavy and smelling of stale sweat and the tobacco we used to settle our nerves. My boots were soaked through, and my toes had gone numb days ago. A dull ache that eventually turned into a strange, hollow sensation. You stop feeling like a human being after a while. You become a part of the landscape, just another gray shape in a gray world. But that piece of brass, that illegal little modification Miller was working on, it felt like a spark of defiance. It was us saying that we weren't just cogs in a machine. We were men who wanted to see home again. We were men who were tired of watching our friends die because some officer 300 miles behind the lines thought he knew better than the mud. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. The hack worked better than we ever dreamed. When the Germans finally made their move, emerging from the tree line like ghosts in the mist, we let them get close. We waited until we could see the steam rising from their breath. Then, Miller dropped the first modified round into the tube. Usually there's a slight delay, a mechanical cough, but with his sharpened pins, the response was instantaneous. The rounds didn't just fire, they screamed. And because he'd filed the lead edges, they didn't bury themselves in the mud before exploding. They detonated on impact, right at waist height. It was devastating. It was brutal. It was exactly what we needed to break their spirit. We held that line for 3 days using nothing but illegal gear. We'd modified our bars to fire from an open bolt with a filed-down sear that made them nearly impossible to jam, even in the slush. We were becoming a unit of mechanics and outlaws, and for a moment we felt invincible. But the Army has a long memory, and they don't like it when the grunts start thinking for themselves. After the sector was cleared, a colonel came up to inspect our position. He wasn't interested in the fact that we'd held the crossroads against a superior force. He was interested in why our mortar tubes looked like they'd been worked over with a blacksmith's hammer. He saw the filed pins. He saw the modified sears in our rifles. He looked at us like we were vandals who'd spray-painted a cathedral. I remember him standing there, his boots polished to a mirror shine despite the mud around him, telling us that we'd compromised the integrity of the United States Army. Miller was stripped of his rank on the spot. I was given a formal reprimand that followed me for the rest of the war. They told us that what we did was forbidden, that we'd used a hack to bypass the safety of our brothers. They didn't understand that the safety they provided was a myth. The only safety we had was each other and the tools we made with our own hands. They banned Miller from ever touching a weapon again for the duration of his service. They put him in a laundry unit in the rear. He survived the war, but he never talked about it again. He felt the shame they heaped on him, even though he'd saved all of us. I spent the next few months moving through the dark forests of Germany, always carrying that one spare firing pin in my pocket. It was my silent protest. Every time I looked at it, I thought about the line between following orders and doing what's right. In the infantry, that line is often written in blood. I remember one night near Bastogne. The fog was so thick you couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. We were low on everything: food, ammo, hope. My buddy, a guy named Henderson from Kentucky, was shivering so hard his teeth were clicking like a telegraph. He looked at me and asked if I thought we'd ever get back to a place where things made sense again, where rules were things you followed because they were good, not just because they were rules. I didn't have an answer for him then. I just rubbed that piece of brass in my pocket and told him to keep his head down. We were learning that the war wasn't just about fighting the enemy. It was about surviving the system that sent us there. The things you remember are never the big battles you see in the movies. You remember the way the light hit a frozen puddle before an artillery shell shattered it. You remember the taste of a stolen apple that was half rotten but tasted like the finest meal on earth. And you remember the guilt. I still feel guilty that Miller took the fall for all of us. We all used those modified weapons. We all knew it was against the regs. But we let the kid with the watchmaker's hands carry the weight of the forbidden hack. At 92, those thoughts don't go away. They just get louder in the silence of the night. You start to realize that the bans and the reprimands of the world don't mean much when you're facing the end of the road. What matters is who you stood by when the world was falling apart. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. I remember when we finally crossed into Germany, there was a change in the air. It wasn't just the geography, it was the realization that we were entering the heart of the machine we'd been fighting. The houses were different, sturdier, grimmer. The people we saw weren't the cheering crowds of the French villages. They were silent, watchful eyes behind lace curtains. We felt like invaders, even though we knew we were the liberators. One afternoon, we came across a small farmhouse that had been turned into a makeshift command post. There was a young German boy there, couldn't have been more than 14, wearing a coat 3 sizes too big for him. He had a rifle that was older than he was. He looked at us with so much hate, but behind the hate, there was just pure, unadulterated terror. My sergeant, a man who'd seen too much since North Africa, told us to clear the cellar. I went down there with my M1, the one I'd secretly kept modified against orders. My heart was thumping against my ribs like a trapped bird. I expected an ambush. I expected a fight. What I found was a family huddled together, smelling of potatoes and fear. I stood there in the dark, my finger on that light, illegal trigger. 1 pound of pressure, that was all it took now. The hack had made the rifle so sensitive that a sneeze could set it off. It was a killer's tool. But looking at that family, the modification felt heavy in a different way. It felt like a burden. I realized then that the tools we create to survive sometimes change us in ways we don't realize. I didn't fire. I backed out of that cellar and told the sergeant it was empty. I lied to a superior officer, another forbidden act. But as I walked back out into the cold German sun, I felt a strange sense of peace. The rules say you don't show mercy to the enemy. The rules say you report every detail. But the rules don't have to live with the ghosts. I do. I carried that secret just like I carried that piece of brass. We were all just trying to keep our humanity intact while the world tried to grind it into the dirt. As the winter of 44 bled into the spring of 45, the war took on a surreal quality. We were moving so fast that the maps couldn't keep up. We were seeing things that didn't fit into the reality we'd known. We found the camps. I don't like to talk about that part much. There are no hacks for what we saw there. No clever modifications or shortcuts can fix that kind of brokenness. It stays with you, a cold knot in your stomach that never quite thaws out. It made our petty squabbles with the colonel and his regulations seem like child's play. We realized that the reason those regulations existed, the reason they wanted us to be by the book, was to keep us from becoming the very thing we were fighting. But they didn't understand that you can't fight a monster without getting some of the soot on your own soul. You do what you have to do, and then you spend the rest of your life trying to wash it off. I remember sitting in a captured courtyard in Munich after the surrender. The silence was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. For years, there had been a constant hum of engines, the whistle of shells, the shouting of men, and then, suddenly nothing. Just the sound of a bird chirping in a ruined apple tree. I took my M1 apart one last time before we turned them in. I removed that filed down piece of brass and replaced it with a standard part I'd scavenged from a supply depot. I didn't want the evidence of our hack to be found. I wanted to go back to being a civilian, back to being a man who followed the rules. But as I held that small piece of brass in my palm, I knew I'd never really be that person again. You can't unlearn the things the war teaches you. You can't forget the feeling of a hair trigger or the sound of a mortar round that detonates exactly where it's supposed to. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. When I finally got back home to Pennsylvania, the world seemed too bright and too loud. People wanted to hear stories of heroism. They wanted to hear about the big V for victory. They didn't want to hear about the forbidden hacks or the boys like Miller who were broken by the very system they served. I got a job in a factory, worked 40 years, raised 3 kids. I followed every rule. I paid my taxes. I drove the speed limit. I never stepped off the sidewalk if the sign said, "Don't walk." I think I was trying to make up for those years in the mud where I lived outside the law. But every now and then, when I'm fixing a leaky faucet or working on the car, I find myself looking for a shortcut. I find myself thinking about how to make a tool work better than it was intended to. It's a ghost of the war, I suppose. That instinct to survive is a hard thing to kill. I'm 92 now, and most of the men I served with are gone. Miller died back in the 80s. He never did go back to watchmaking. Said his hands shook too much after the laundry detail. I think about him a lot. I think about that colonel and his polished boots. I wonder if he ever had to use a weapon that didn't work. I wonder if he ever had to choose between a regulation and a life. Probably not. Men like that usually make it through the war with their books intact and their souls untouched. But me? I'd rather have my ghosts and my piece of brass. It reminds me that even in the darkest times, there's a part of us that can't be standardized. There's a part of us that will always find a way, even if it's forbidden. I'm telling this story now because I don't want the small history to be lost. History books talk about generals and treaties, but they don't talk about the firing pins. They don't talk about the kid who filed a piece of metal to save his friends and got banned for his trouble. They don't talk about the moral weight of a hair trigger. Those are the things that stay with a soldier. Those are the things that make us who we are. I've carried this secret for 80 years, and it feels lighter now, sharing it with you. The war wasn't a movie. It was a series of impossible choices made by very young men in very bad conditions. And sometimes, the only way to do the right thing was to break the rules. Looking back, that forbidden hack wasn't just about the equipment. It was about the realization that the world is imperfect, and the rules are often made by people who aren't in the fight. We did what we had to do. We saved who we could. And if that makes us outlaws in the eyes of the army, then I can live with that. I've lived with it this long. I hope that whoever finds that box of mine one day understands that it's not just junk. It's a piece of a man who learned that survival sometimes requires a little bit of rebellion. And in the end, that's the only hack that really matters. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. The dampness of the French soil had a way of getting into your bones that no fire could ever truly warm out. I remember one specific night, just before the breakthrough at St. Lo. We were sitting in a ditch, sharing a single tin of cold beans. The rain was coming down in those long, thin needles that seemed to soak through even the thickest canvas. My friend Eddie, a loudmouthed kid from Brooklyn who could find a joke in a funeral, was unusually quiet. He was staring at his rifle, an M1 Garand that had seen better days. The bolt was sluggish, caked with that fine gray silt that seemed to be everywhere. He looked at me and said, "Henry, if this thing clicks when it should bang tomorrow, tell my mother I was thinking of her, okay?" That was the reality. We were armed with the best equipment in the world, but the world we were in was trying its best to make it fail. That was when I started thinking about what Miller had done. That was when I realized that being a good soldier and being a living soldier weren't always the same thing. I spent that night under my poncho with a small piece of emery cloth I'd traded a pack of Lucky Strikes for. I wasn't an expert like Miller, but I'd watched him. I knew where the friction points were. I knew which parts of the assembly were purely for safety and which ones were for function. I started polishing. I removed the factory burrs that the assembly line had missed in their rush to meet quotas. I was committing my first forbidden hack. It felt like a betrayal at first, like I was desecrating a holy relic. We were taught to treat our rifles like our own children. But as the metal became smooth under my touch, that feeling of betrayal turned into a feeling of control. I wasn't just a target anymore. I was a man with a tool that I understood. By the time the sun started to bleed through the clouds, my Garand didn't just cycle, it glided. The attack came at dawn. We had to cross an open field that was nothing but mud and craters. The Germans had a line of bunkers on the far side, and they weren't going to let us take them without a price. As we rose out of that ditch, the world exploded. I remember the sound of the dirt kicking up around my boots, the hot zipping of bullets passing so close they felt like bee stings. I dropped into a crater and shouldered my rifle. I didn't think about the manual. I didn't think about the colonel. I just squeezed. The rifle spoke with a crispness I'd never heard before. 8 rounds, rapid fire, no jams, no hesitation. I could see the impact of my shots on the bunker's embrasure. I felt like I had a direct line to the enemy. Eddie was next to me, his rifle chattering away, a grin on his face that was half madness and half relief. We made it to the bunker. We took it. And as I sat against the cold concrete, my heart hammering, I knew that the hack was the only reason I was still breathing. But news of field modifications spreads fast in a platoon. Pretty soon, everyone wanted their sears polished and their pins sharpened. We became a shadow workshop. We'd sit in the dark with our files and our cloths, whispering about the best way to bypass the governors on the Jeep engines, or how to wrap the tank mufflers in wet burlap to dampen the sound. It was a secret language of survival. We were building a different kind of army, one that lived in the gaps between the regulations. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. The problem with breaking the rules is that it becomes a habit. Once you realize the forbidden things can save you, you start looking for them everywhere. We found a crashed German plane once, an old Stuka that had come down in a field. Most of the guys wanted to scavenge for souvenirs, iron crosses or Lugers. But I was looking at the wiring. I was looking at the way they'd engineered their oxygen regulators. I realized they had things we didn't, and we had things they didn't. I took a piece of the plexiglass from the canopy and fashioned a small, clear shield for my watch. It sounds like a small thing, but keeping the mud off the face meant I could actually time our movements accurately. It was another hack. My sergeant saw it and just shook his head. "Lawson," he said, "you're going to end up in Leavenworth or the Pentagon. I just haven't figured out which one yet." I never did end up in either. I just ended up old. But I think about the ingenuity of those boys. We were mostly farmers and factory workers, people who were used to making do with what we had. The army tried to turn us into robots, but the war turned us back into humans. We were tinkerers and fixers. I remember a guy named Salty who figured out how to use the heat from the tank exhausts to cook our rations so we wouldn't have to start fires that would give away our position. It was strictly against the fire safety regs, but it kept us from starving. We were a band generation in some ways, doing things that the world didn't want to admit were necessary. We were the illegal depth charges in a sea of U-boats. We were the forbidden solution to a problem that shouldn't have existed. I still dream about the sound of the file on metal. It's a soothing sound to me now, like a lullaby. It reminds me of the nights when we were still together, before the world pulled us apart. I wonder if the kids today understand that. Everything is so digital now, so perfect. You can't file down a computer chip to make it work better in the mud. You can't hack a drone with a piece of emery cloth. There's something lost in that, I think. A sense of connection to the things we use. We knew our gear because we'd bled on it, modified it, and risked our lives for it. It wasn't just equipment, it was an extension of our will to live. The hardest part wasn't the fighting, it was the waiting. We spent weeks sitting in the same holes, watching the seasons change from a square of dirt. That's when the hacks really became important. We'd build elaborate stoves out of ammunition cans, or we'd figure out how to weave our own socks out of unraveled sweaters, because the ones we were issued had holes in them within a week. We were a DIY army. I remember one guy, a quiet fella from Oregon, who figured out how to make a periscope out of 2 pocket mirrors and a piece of scrap wood. It let us see over the edge of the foxhole without getting our heads blown off. The officers hated it because it promoted cowardice. They wanted us to look the enemy in the eye. Easy to say when you're looking through binoculars from a mile back. We used the periscopes anyway. We called them Lawson's eyes because I was the one who scrounged the mirrors. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. I remember the day the war ended for me. It wasn't the day Germany surrendered. It was the day I realized I didn't need the hacks anymore. We were in a small town near the Czech border, and for the first time in a year, I slept in a real bed with white sheets. I woke up and reached for my rifle, my thumb tracing the smooth, polished sear. I realized I didn't have to hide it anymore. I didn't have to worry about the colonel's boots. The world was going back to the book. But as I looked at my reflection in the window, I saw a man who didn't fit in the book anymore. I was thinner, grimmer, and my hands had a permanent stain of oil and carbon that wouldn't wash off. I had become a part of the forbidden history. When I talk to my grandkids, they ask me if I was a hero. I tell them no. I tell them I was a survivor who knew how to use a file. I tell them about Miller and his watchmaker hands. I tell them that sometimes the most important thing you can do is refuse to accept that things have to be the way they are. If the machine is broken, you fix it. If the rules are wrong, you bend them until they work for the people who matter. That's the real forbidden hack. It's the realization that you have the power to change your own circumstances, even when the whole world is trying to tell you otherwise. I don't have much time left now. The doctors say my heart is like one of those old Jeep engines, lots of patches and a few illegal modifications of its own. I'm okay with that. I've lived a long life, and I've seen the world change in ways I never thought possible. But when the lights go down and the house is quiet, I'm back in that ditch in France. I'm feeling the grit of the emery cloth under my thumb. I'm hearing the whispered voices of men who are long gone, and I'm holding that piece of brass, knowing that it's the only thing that kept me here to tell you this. Don't ever let anyone tell you that you're just a cog. You're the one who can change the machine. You're the one who can find the hack. I hope you never have to know the smell of a winter war. I hope you never have to choose between your honor and your life. But if you do, remember that the book wasn't written for the man in the mud. It was written for the man in the office. Trust your hands, trust your friends, and don't be afraid to file down the rough edges. The world might ban you for it, but you'll be alive to hear about it. And at the end of the day, that's the only victory that counts. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. I'm sitting here now, looking out at the Pennsylvania hills, and they look so much like the hills of France sometimes. The way the fog rolls in during the morning, it's like a curtain being pulled over the past. I think about the sailor from the title of this story. I never met him, but I knew men like him. I knew the ones who saw a depth charge and thought, I can make this better. I knew the ones who looked at a U-boat and thought, I have a hack for that. We were all the same. We were all just sailors and soldiers trying to find a way through the dark. We were the forbidden ones. And I think, in the end, we were the ones who truly won the war. Not the generals, not the politicians. Just the men with the files and the will to survive. The winter of 1944 was a teacher like no other. It taught you that the cold doesn't care about your rank, and the wind doesn't care about your mission. It taught you that a single modified piece of equipment could be the difference between seeing the spring and becoming part of the permafrost. I remember a night during the bulge when the oil in our rifles had turned to the consistency of molasses. If you tried to fire, the firing pin would just crawl forward, a slow-motion thud that wouldn't even dent the primer. We were helpless. That was when Salty showed us his next hack. He'd figured out that if you mixed a tiny bit of kerosene from a lantern with a specific kind of grease scavenged from a captured truck, the mixture wouldn't freeze until it hit 50 below. It was a chemical hack that was strictly forbidden by the Ordnance Department. They said it would corrode the barrels. We said we'd rather have a corroded barrel than a dead body. We cleaned our rifles with that illegal sludge. And when the Germans came, our guns sang while others stayed silent. It's funny what the mind holds on to. I don't remember the name of the town we were defending that night, but I remember the exact smell of that kerosene grease mix. It was acrid and sharp, a smell that meant life. I remember the way it felt on my skin, slippery and cold. We were all banned in that moment. all of us technical criminals according to the Army's regulations. But as we sat in the dark, watching the tracer rounds arc across the sky like falling stars, there was a sense of brotherhood that no regulation could ever create. We were the keepers of the forbidden knowledge. We were the ones who knew how to keep the fire going when the world wanted to put it out. I sometimes wonder what happened to all that modified equipment. I imagine some of it is still out there, buried in the fields of France or the forests of Germany. A rusted M1 with a polished sear, a mortar tube with a sharpened pin. They're like time capsules of our desperation and our ingenuity. I hope that if anyone ever finds them, they don't see them as broken. I hope they see them as fixed. Because that's what we were doing. We were fixing a broken world, one hack at a time. And if we had to break a few rules to do it, well, that's just the price of admission. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. The day I got my reprimand, I felt like my world was ending. I was a kid who'd always colored inside the lines. I believed in the system, but as I stood there in front of that colonel, I realized that the system didn't believe in me. It believed in its own survival, not mine. That was the most important lesson I ever learned. It was more important than anything they taught me in basic training. It was the hack for my own life. I learned to look at the world with a critical eye, to ask why, instead of just how. I learned that the people in charge don't always have the answers, and sometimes the best answer is the one you find yourself. I'm tired now. The memories are heavy today, but I wanted to tell you about the forbidden hack, not because it's a great war story, but because it's a story about being human. It's a story about the little things that make a big difference. It's a story about a piece of brass in a velvet box. I hope you find your own hacks in life. I hope you find the things that make your own rifle work when the world gets cold. And I hope you have the courage to use them, even if they're forbidden. Because in the end, you're the one who has to live with the result. I'm 92 years old, and I can tell you, I have no regrets about that piece of brass. None at all. The crossing of the Rhine wasn't the heroic spectacle the newsreels made it out to be. It felt like the edge of the world. Everything we'd been through, the hedgerows, the freezing hell of the Ardennes, it all felt like a prologue to this one final barrier. But the Army's plan for the crossing was a mess on the ground. They had these assault boats that were practically made of cardboard and hope. The engines were prone to flooding, and the paddles were too short for the current. I saw a group of engineers huddled around one of the boat motors, looking at a manual that might as well have been written in ancient Greek for all the good it did them in that wind. That's when I saw a guy named Cooper, a Navy transfer who'd ended up in our unit because of some clerical error back in England. He wasn't looking at the manual. He was looking at a set of spark plugs and a bottle of high-octane aviation fuel he'd liberated from a downed P-47. Cooper was the one who first told me about the legendary hack that saved his skin back in the North Atlantic. He sat there, his grease-stained hands moving with a purpose that the officers never understood. He told me about a sailor he'd served with, a man named Miller, not my Pittsburgh Miller, but another one, who'd been stationed on a destroyer escort. They were hunting U-boats, but the depth charges they were using were timed for a specific pressure. The Germans had figured that out. They'd dive just below the standard detonation depth and sit there, laughing while the surface stayed calm. This sailor, this madman, decided he'd had enough of watching his brothers get torpedoed by ghosts. He stayed up for 48 hours straight in the armory, filing down the pressure release valves on the charges. It was an illegal modification. If a charge went off too early, it would strip the hull of their own ship. It was a court-martial offense, a forbidden hack that the Navy High Command would have banned in a heartbeat. But that sailor didn't care about the ban. He cared about the 7 U-boats that were picking them off like sitting ducks. He modified the charges so they'd blow the second they hit the water if he wanted them to, or sink twice as fast. They called it the forbidden hack. In one single patrol, that ship sank 7 U-boats. 7. The Navy was humiliated. They couldn't give him a medal because he'd broken every safety regulation in the book. So, they did what the military does best when it's embarrassed. They banned him from the fleet and buried the report. Cooper told me that story while he poured that blue aviation fuel into the boat motor. "Henry," he said, "the brass wants us to die by the rules. I'd rather live by a hack. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. We crossed the Rhine that night. The motor didn't just run, it screamed. We moved twice as fast as the other boats, cutting through the black water like a knife. The German shore batteries were firing blindly into the mist, but we were moving too fast for them to lead us. When we hit the bank, we were the first ones there. We took the machine gun nests, while the by-the-book units were still struggling with flooded engines in the middle of the river. I looked at Cooper as we took cover behind a stone wall, and he just winked. He'd used the sailor's logic. He'd seen the problem, ignored the rule, and found the solution. I realized then that the war wasn't going to be won by the smartest generals or the biggest bombs. It was going to be won by the men who knew how to tinker with the gears of fate. As we moved deeper into the German heartland, the atmosphere changed. It wasn't the open fields of France anymore. It was tight, claustrophobic villages and deep, dark forests where the trees felt like they were watching you. The Germans were desperate now. They were using everything they had: V-2 rockets, jet planes, and kids who hadn't started shaving yet. Our equipment was taking a beating. My M1 was starting to show signs of wear that no amount of cleaning could fix. The barrel was getting shot out, meaning the rifling was disappearing, and my accuracy was dropping. I told my sergeant, and he told me to wait for a replacement. "We're out of stock, Lawson. Use what you got." That was the Army's answer for everything. Use the broken thing until it breaks you. I found a discarded German Mauser in a cellar one night. It was a beautiful piece of machinery, even if it belonged to the enemy. The bolt action was like silk. I knew I wasn't supposed to carry trophy weapons into combat. It was another one of those rules. Standardization of ammunition, they called it. If I ran out of German rounds, I was useless, but I didn't care. I took the firing pin out of that Mauser and spent the night trying to see if I could adapt its spring tension to my Garand. It was a delicate operation, done by the light of a single candle. I was hacking the most iconic American weapon with German parts. If the colonel had seen me, he probably would have had me shot for treason. But when I was done, my M1 had a trigger pull that was so smooth, it felt like it was reading my mind. It was my own version of the forbidden hack. One afternoon, we were tasked with clearing a wooded ridge that overlooked a vital supply route. The Germans had a sniper up there who was a real artist. He wasn't just shooting to kill, he was shooting to pin us down. He'd hit a man in the leg, wait for two guys to come out and help him, and then he'd take out all three. It was a cold, calculated way to fight. We were stuck in a ditch for 6 hours, the sun beating down on us, the smell of our own fear thick in the air. Our mortar team tried to flush him out, but their rounds were falling short. "The elevation's wrong on the sights," they yelled. "The book says this is the range, but the shells are drifting." I crawled over to them, my modified M1 slung across my back. I remembered what Miller had done with the firing pins. I looked at their mortar tube and saw the problem. The base plate was sinking into the soft mud, changing the angle every time they fired. The book assumed you were firing from solid ground. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. I told them to grab some of the flat stones from the wall and wedge them under the plate at a specific angle. "That's not in the manual, Lawson," the corporal snapped. "The manual says to use the leveling bubbles." I looked at him and said, "The bubbles are lying to you because the ground is moving. Use the stones." They didn't listen at first. They fired another round, and it landed even further away. Finally, with the sniper's bullets snapping over our heads, they tried the stone hack. The next round was a direct hit. The sniper's nest exploded in a cloud of pine needles and gray wool. We moved up the ridge, and for a second, the corporal looked at me like I was a magician. I wasn't a magician. I was just a man who'd stopped believing that the people who wrote the manuals had ever stood in a muddy ditch in Germany. The war ended for me in a hospital in Belgium. I'd caught a piece of shrapnel in my shoulder during a patrol near the Elbe. It wasn't a heroic wound, I just tripped at the wrong time. While I was lying there, surrounded by the smell of antiseptic and the sound of men groaning in their sleep, I had a lot of time to think. I thought about that sailor who sank the 7 U-boats. I thought about Cooper and his aviation fuel. I thought about Miller and his watchmaker hands. We were a generation of hackers. We'd been thrown into a machine that was too big, too cold, and too broken, and we'd had to find our own ways to make it work. The forbidden things weren't just about gear, they were about our minds. We'd learned to think for ourselves, and that was the most dangerous hack of all. When I finally got my discharge papers, they were clean. No mention of the reprimand, no mention of the modified weapons. It was like the Army wanted to erase the parts of us that didn't fit their narrative. They wanted us to go home and be the same boys we were when we left, but you can't go back. Once you've filed down the sear on your soul, you can't ever make it standard again. I went back to Pennsylvania, but the factory felt like a prison. The rules felt like chains. I'd spent 2 years living by my wits, and now I was expected to follow a clock and a foreman. I struggled for a long time. I drank too much, I stayed up too late, and I kept that piece of brass in my pocket like a talisman. It was the only thing that felt real. I remember meeting a guy at a VFW hall in the 50s. He'd been a mechanic on an aircraft carrier. We got to talking, and I mentioned the forbidden hacks we'd used in the infantry. He laughed and told me about how they used to bypass the safety limiters on the catapults so they could launch planes with heavier bomb loads than the ships were designed for. The engineers said the cables would snap, he said. But we knew the cables. We knew they could handle it if we greased them just right. It was everywhere, every branch, every unit. The war was won by men who knew when to ignore the experts. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. I'm 92 years old now, and I'm finally ready to let go of the secret. For years, I was afraid that telling these stories would make us look like bad soldiers. I was afraid people would think we were undisciplined or dangerous, but now I see it differently. We were the best soldiers because we knew how to adapt. We knew that the forbidden path was often the only one that led home. The sailor who sank those 7 U-boats, he was a hero, even if the Navy couldn't admit it. Cooper was a hero. Miller was a hero. And maybe, in my own small way, I was one too. Not because I followed orders, but because I knew when to break them. I look at the world today and I see so many rules. I see people waiting for permission to do what needs to be done. I want to tell them to find their own hack. I want to tell them that the manual is just a suggestion when the world is on fire. Don't be afraid to sharpen the pin. Don't be afraid to polish the sear. The people who tell you it's forbidden are usually the ones who aren't in the fight with you. They don't have to live with the consequences of failure. You do. So make sure your tools work, make sure your mind is sharp, and never ever let them tell you that you're just a part of their machine. I still have that file, you know. It's rusted now, the teeth are dull, but I keep it in the same box as the brass. It's the most important tool I ever owned. It didn't just shape metal, it shaped me. It taught me that my life was my own and that I had the right to fight for it with everything I had. I hope that when you hear this, you don't just see a story about a war from 80 years ago. I hope you see a story about the strength of the human spirit. We are a species of tinkerers. We are the ones who find the gaps. And as long as there are people willing to use the forbidden hack, there will always be hope, even in the darkest mud of the Ardennes. The night is getting cold again, just like it did in France. My joints ache and my breath is short, but I feel a peace I haven't felt in a long time. I've said what I needed to say. The ghosts are quiet for once. I can see Miller smiling, his hands finally steady. I can see Cooper pouring that blue fuel into the night. We're all still there, in that space between the rules and the reality. We're the ones who survived, and we did it our way. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. I've often wondered about that sailor, the one who started it all for me. Did he live a long life? Did he ever tell his kids about the U-boats? Or did he carry that ban like a weight until the very end? I like to think he knew. I like to think he sat on a porch somewhere, just like I am, and looked at the ocean and smiled. He knew what he'd done. He knew that 7 crews went home because he had the courage to be a criminal for a night. That's a good way to go out. That's a legacy worth having. I'm just a 92-year-old man from Pennsylvania, but I'm proud to be a part of that same forbidden tradition. There was a time, right before we crossed the Elbe, when we came across a group of German prisoners. They weren't the supermen the propaganda talked about. They were just tired, hungry men who wanted the nightmare to end. I saw one of them trying to fix a broken boot with a piece of wire. He was struggling, his fingers blue with cold. I walked over to him, and for a second, he thought I was going to hit him. I didn't. I reached into my kit and pulled out my small, illegal file. I showed him how to notch the leather so the wire would hold. He looked at me with this expression of pure shock. We didn't speak the same language, but we spoke the language of the hack. In that moment, the war didn't exist. There was just 2 men and a broken tool. I realized then that the forbidden things were often the most human things of all. We'd all been forced into these roles, these uniforms, but underneath, we were still just trying to solve the same problems. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. The Army eventually got their equipment back. When I turned in my M1, I felt a strange sense of loss. It was just a piece of wood and steel, but it had been my constant companion through the worst days of my life. I'd modified it, cared for it, and trusted it more than I trusted any general. I wondered if the armorer who received it would notice the polished sear or the custom spring. I wondered if he'd just toss it into a pile with all the others. Another standard rifle for a standard war. I hoped he wouldn't. I hoped that maybe, just maybe, that rifle would find its way to another kid who needed a hair trigger to stay alive. But deep down, I knew it didn't matter. The hack wasn't in the gun. It was in me, and they couldn't take that away. I think that's why I'm still here at 92. I've been hacking my way through the years, refusing to let the clock run me down by the book. I've outlived the doctors who told me to quit smoking, and I've outlived the bankers who told me I'd never own a home. I've lived my life on my own terms, with a few forbidden modifications along the way. And as I sit here watching the sun dip below the horizon, I can tell you that it's been a hell of a ride. I've carried the weight of those 40 men, and I've carried the secret of the firing pins. But I've also carried the knowledge that I was free. I was a soldier, yes, but I was also a man who knew how to use a file, and in the end, that was enough. The silence of the Ardennes in December of '44 was something that no movie could ever truly capture. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket of cold that made you feel like the world had simply stopped breathing. We were stretched thin, holding a line that was more of a suggestion than a reality. The brass called it a quiet sector. They told us to settle in and wait for the spring. But the book didn't account for the fact that the Germans were massing an entire army right under our noses. It didn't account for the fact that our winter gear was stuck in a warehouse in Cherbourg because of some logistical regulation that prioritized parade uniforms for the liberation ceremonies over wool socks for the grunts in the holes. That's when we realized that if we were going to survive the winter, we had to become outlaws of necessity once again. I remember Salty, the tank mechanic I mentioned before, crawling into my foxhole one night with a crazed look in his eyes. He wasn't carrying a wrench. He was carrying a gallon of gasoline and a handful of dirt. He showed us how to make what he called a trench heater, using a discarded C-ration can and a specific mixture of sand and fuel. It was a beautiful, dangerous little hack. If you did it right, it would provide a tiny, smokeless flame that could warm your hands and heat your coffee. If you did it wrong, or if a superior officer saw the light, you were in for a world of trouble. The manual strictly forbade open flames of any kind. Light discipline, they hammered into our heads. But when your fingers are so frozen you can't even feel the trigger, light discipline becomes a death sentence. We ran those heaters every night, tucked under our ponchos, sharing the warmth like it was gold. We were hacking the very environment we were trapped in. It was during one of those long frozen nights that Cooper really sat me down and told me the full story of that sailor and the depth charges. He said the man's name was Elias Vance, a chief petty officer on a destroyer escort in the North Atlantic. Vance was a man who'd been at sea since before the Great War, and he had no patience for the theories of the young academy officers. These officers were convinced that the U-boats were following a predictable dive pattern, and they insisted on setting the depth charge fuses to 150 feet. But Vance had been watching the sonar returns. He saw that the Germans were actually cutting their engines and gliding down to 250 feet the moment they heard the pings. They were sitting in the dead zone where our charges were useless. Vance went to the captain, a man who lived and died by the Navy regulations, and asked for permission to bypass the safety limiters on the K-guns. The captain refused, citing safety protocols and the risk of premature detonation. So Vance did what any good hacker does. He waited until the captain was asleep. He and a couple of trusted crewmen went into the magazine with a set of unauthorized tools. They didn't just file the pins. They completely redesigned the pressure-sensitive bellows inside the charges using scraps of rubber and copper wire. It was a massive gamble. If those charges went off on the deck, the ship would have been blown in half. But the next time they picked up a contact, Vance personally oversaw the launch. Those modified charges sank 4 U-boats in less than 6 hours. The crew cheered, but the captain was livid. He knew Vance had disobeyed a direct order. He couldn't deny the results, but he also couldn't allow the precedent of a sailor thinking for himself. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. The Navy gave Vance an administrative discharge. They stripped him of his retirement and banned him from ever serving on a combat vessel again. They called his hack reckless, even though it had saved thousands of tons of shipping and hundreds of American lives. Cooper told me that story while we were shivering in that French ditch, and it struck a chord in me. It made me realize that the forbidden label is often just a way for people in power to protect their own egos. They'd rather lose a war the right way than win it the wrong way. But for us, the men in the mud, there was no such thing as the wrong way to win. There was only coming home or staying there forever. As the German offensive, what everyone calls the Battle of the Bulge now, finally slammed into us, all those little hacks we'd been practicing became our only lifeline. The Germans were using infiltrators, guys dressed in American uniforms who spoke perfect English, trying to sow confusion behind our lines. They'd change road signs and cut telephone wires. The official protocol was to use password and countersign, but the infiltrators knew the passwords. So we developed our own social hack. We started asking questions that only a real American would know. Not the stuff in the books like the capital of a state, but the stuff you only knew if you'd lived it. Who won the World Series in '41? What's the name of the girl on the front of the Lucky Strike pack? How do you like your eggs at a diner? It was an unofficial, forbidden way of identifying ourselves, and it caught more than a few of those German commandos off guard. I remember one afternoon when we were being harried by a German armored car. It was a fast, nimble thing with a 20mm cannon that was chewing up our cover. We didn't have any anti-tank weapons left. Our bazooka was a twisted piece of scrap metal from a mortar hit. My buddy Henderson, the one who was always thinking 3 steps ahead, looked at our crate of smoke grenades. "The manual says these are for concealment, Henry," he said with a grin. "But I bet if we tie 4 of them together and shove them into the air intake of that car, it'll think it's on fire." It was a classic forbidden hack. We weren't supposed to get that close to armor, and we certainly weren't supposed to waste smoke grenades on an attack. But we did it. Henderson crawled through the slush, waited for the car to pass a stone wall, and jammed his homemade smoke bomb into the rear vent. The car stopped within 10 yards, the crew scrambling out because they thought the engine was about to explode. We took them prisoner without firing a single shot. The things we did to our Thompson submachine guns were even more illegal. The Thompson was a great weapon, but it was heavy, and the 20-round box magazines were always running out at the worst time. Some of the guys started welding 2 magazines together, jungle style, but that was frowned upon because it could strain the magazine catch. I took it a step further. I noticed that the followers in the magazines had a lot of wasted space at the bottom. I spent a whole afternoon filing down the plastic followers just enough to squeeze in 2 extra rounds. 22 rounds instead of 20. It doesn't sound like much, but in a firefight, those 2 extra bullets are the difference between life and a reload. I got caught by a lieutenant who was doing a spot inspection. He looked at my modified magazines and asked what the hell I was doing. I told him I was increasing efficiency. He told me I was damaging government property and threatened to take my pay. I just looked at him and said, "Sir, if those 2 rounds save your life tomorrow, you can have my whole paycheck." He didn't say another word, but he didn't make me change them back either. The moral weight of these hacks started to settle on us as we moved into 1945. We were becoming a different kind of soldier, cynical perhaps, but also incredibly capable. We'd learned that the world wasn't a neat place where rules always led to justice. We'd seen good men die because they followed orders to the letter, and we'd seen bad soldiers survive because they knew how to cheat the system. It changes your perspective on authority. It makes you realize that the most important authority you'll ever answer to is your own conscience. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. I remember a moment in a small village near the German border. We'd taken a lot of casualties, and our medic, a soft-spoken boy named Doc Miller, everyone seemed to be named Miller back then, was out of morphine. He had 3 men who were in agony, and the supply lines were blocked by a snowstorm. He was supposed to wait for the official channels, but Doc knew a forbidden hack of his own. He'd learned from a French doctor that a certain mixture of high-proof alcohol, which we'd liberated from a German cellar, and a concentrated dose of heavy-duty aspirin could act as a makeshift sedative. It wasn't regulation, and it was technically poisoning the troops according to the medical manual. But Doc did it. He sat with those men all night, dosing them with his illegal cocktail, and he kept them from going into shock. He saved them, but he never put it in his report. He knew the Army wouldn't see it as a miracle, they'd see it as a liability. That's the thing about the forbidden hack. It's a lonely path. You don't get the medals for it. You don't get the parade. You just get the quiet satisfaction of knowing you did what was necessary when the system failed you. Elias Vance, the sailor with the depth charges, understood that better than anyone. He chose the ban and the shame over the lives of his crew. To me, that's the highest form of courage. It's easy to be brave when everyone is cheering for you. It's a lot harder to be brave when the people you're saving are the ones who are going to punish you for it. I look at my hands now, 80 years later, and I can still feel the ghost of that file. I can feel the vibration of the metal being shaped. I think about all the hacks I've used in my life since the war. When the roof of our first house leaked and the contractor said it couldn't be fixed without a full replacement we couldn't afford, I used a trick I'd learned from a French farmer to seal it with pitch and old canvas. When my oldest son's car broke down in the middle of a Nevada desert, I used a piece of a leather belt to replace a fan belt, a forbidden repair that got us 60 miles to the nearest station. The war taught me that there is always a way, provided you're willing to look past the official solution. I'm 92, and I'm one of the last ones left who remembers the silent army of hackers. We were the ones who kept the trucks running with bootlace gaskets and kept the radios talking with foil from cigarette packs. We were the ones who ignored the ban and did the impossible. I hope that when I'm gone, that spirit of ingenuity doesn't die with me. I hope people realize that the rules are there to serve us, not the other way around. If a rule is standing in the way of what's right or what's necessary for survival, then that rule is the thing that's broken, not the man who breaks it. I remember the final days of the war, when we were seeing the end of the 1,000-year Reich. It was a pathetic sight. The forbidden hacks the Germans were using at the end were desperate and cruel. Booby-trapped toys, poisoned wells. It showed the difference between a hack born of survival and a hack born of malice. We'd used our ingenuity to protect our brothers. They were using theirs to destroy everything in a final, spiteful tantrum. It made me proud of our illegal heaters and our modified magazines. We'd kept our humanity even when we had to hide it from our own officers. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. When I finally got back to the States and saw the Statue of Liberty, I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like a man who'd escaped a giant grinding machine. I wanted to tell everyone about Elias Vance and Cooper and Miller, but I knew nobody would understand. They wanted the book version of the war. They wanted the polished boots and the synchronized salutes. They didn't want the smell of kerosene and the sound of a file in the dark, so I kept it to myself. I tucked that piece of brass away, and I lived my life. But every time I saw a ship in the harbor, I thought about those 7 U-boats. I thought about the man who was banned for being too good at his job, and I'd touch the brass in my pocket and smile. I'm finally telling this because I want you to know that the real history of the world isn't written in the manuals. It's written in the small, forbidden acts of ordinary people who refuse to give up. It's written in the hacks that save lives and the modifications that make the impossible possible. Don't be afraid to be a Elias Vance in your own life. Don't be afraid to sharpen the pin, because at the end of the day, the only thing that matters is that you stood your ground and you did what was right. The rest is just noise. I'm going to close my eyes now. I can hear the Rhine flowing, and I can hear the crackle of a small, illegal fire in a sea ration can. I can see the faces of the men who stood with me in the mud. We were a band brotherhood, and I wouldn't trade that for all the medals in Washington. We lived, we survived, and we did it by our own rules. That's the ultimate forbidden hack, and it's the best story I've ever had to tell.